Now, let's think about this. If the world's number one power in the Americas, and the super powerful nation with 200 million people at the time, were to face off against the 15 million people in Southeast Asia, most people would bet on the victory of the super powerful nation. But when these two actually confronted each other, that expectation was shattered, and the victory of the super powerful nation was snatched away by the Southeast Asian newborn nation. That's right. The name of the victorious country is Vietnam, and the defeated superpower is the United States. The war in which the United States fought against Vietnam and was knocked out is today's topic, the Vietnam War. The distance between the United States and Vietnam is more than 10,000 kilometers. These countries, which are very far apart, fought for almost 10 years. What we are curious about is why the United States, with its overwhelming power, lost here. Why did this happen? After all, Germany and Japan were defeated in World War II at the same time. Today, I'm going to take a look at the Vietnam War and try to analyze it. First of all, why did these two fight? To understand this, we need to look at the situation in Vietnam at the time. Vietnam has a long history of struggle. It has been invaded multiple times by China and the Mongol Empire, but it was always a battle-hardened nation that defeated them. The problem came in the 19th century when a country appeared that they couldn't stop, France. At that time, France, a passionate imperialist power, came from far away and quickly overran Vietnam with the latest weapons. Eventually, Vietnam was subdued and humiliated by France. With its strong sense of self-esteem, Vietnam dreamed of revenge. After being subjugated for decades, Vietnam finally got its chance in 1940. When Hitler's Nazi Germany occupied France during World War II, France was no longer able to care for its colonies, including Vietnam. This became an opportunity for Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh, a national hero, declared independence and led the forces in northern Vietnam to establish the Vietnam Democratic Republic, also called North Vietnam. However, North Vietnam soon faced a crisis. 5 years later, World War II ended with Germany's defeat, and France regained its territories, including Vietnam. Now that France was back, it began trying to reassert control over Vietnam. This led to a war between the two. Surprisingly, Vietnam won. Ho Chi Minh's North Vietnam, united by a strong resistance mentality, defeated the French army. In the end, France withdrew after signing the Geneva Accords in 1954, bringing an end to the war. But this is where the Vietnam War as we know it starts. The problem arose when the two sides of the war ended in a strange way. Vietnam was divided into two parts under the Geneva Agreement, North Vietnam, controlled by the Communist forces, and South Vietnam, which was under the influence of France and later capitalist powers. If these two sides were suddenly unified, there would be major problems. As a result, the country was divided along the 17th parallel, with the promise of a general election in 2 years to determine if unification would occur. However, this temporary division set the stage for everything that followed. In the upcoming general election, there was a big concern. North Vietnam had a major advantage because it had fought for independence, and the Vietnamese people were more sympathetic to the North than to the South. This meant that North Vietnam had a high chance of winning the election. If North Vietnam won, all of Vietnam would likely become communist, leading to communist domination in Southeast Asia. At this time, another country stepped in, the United States. This was the 1950s, during the Cold War, when tensions were high between the United States and the Soviet Union. The U.S. was particularly concerned about the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, as the domino theory suggested that if one country became communist, neighboring countries would follow. From the U.S. perspective, the spread of communism in Vietnam would lead to the expansion of Soviet influence in the region, which was a direct threat. The U.S. became deeply worried about the situation. Fortunately for the U.S., South Vietnam refused to hold the elections and instead, in 1955, held its own government election, establishing the Republic of Vietnam. Ngo Dinh Diem was elected as the president of South Vietnam. However, the situation was still precarious. North Vietnam continued to oppose this, threatening to unify the country by force. To stop this, the U.S. decided to intervene. The U.S. began pouring money and military aid into South Vietnam to strengthen it and prevent the spread of communism. The hope was that if South Vietnam became stronger, it could resist the North and keep Vietnam from becoming communist. However, there was a problem. South Vietnam's first president, Ngo Dinh Diem, was incompetent and corrupt. Despite the U.S. efforts, South Vietnam was on the brink of collapse, rather than developing as hoped. As a result, the United States' financial support led to corruption, with politics dominated by elites. If he had become president, he should have helped the farmers, who are the foundation of the country, live better. He should have supported the farmers. Instead, he used land policy as a tool for exploitation, causing even more suffering for the peasants. As a result, the peasants rebelled dramatically. But were they met with support? No, they were arrested by the secret police and imprisoned. Of course, South Vietnam was in turmoil, and the dissatisfaction of the peasants grew. Then, some people saw an opportunity. These were the communists in South Vietnam. In order to exploit this unrest, the South Vietnamese communists approached the angry farmers. "Hey, farmers, you really hate the Ngo Dinh Diem government, right? Then join the Communist Party and let's overthrow the Ngo Dinh Diem government together," they tempted them. Soon, the farmers united with the communists. This led to the formation of the South Vietnamese People's Liberation Front. That's right. These were the famous Viet Cong. The Viet Cong was different from North Vietnam. While North Vietnam was a communist force led by Ho Chi Minh, the Viet Cong was a communist group opposed to the South Vietnamese government, uniting both communists and farmers. When the Viet Cong formed, South Vietnam was in chaos. The government of Ngo Dinh Diem collapsed, and the farmers rebelled. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong began their activities, further destabilizing the country. Additionally, the North Vietnamese army was engaging in battles with the South Vietnamese army along the border. The United States, observing all of this, became concerned. If the situation continued, it seemed inevitable that North Vietnam would take control. Reunification under communist rule seemed like only a matter of time. That's why the United States felt it had to act to prevent Vietnam from falling to communism. So the U.S. decided, let's remove the cause of all this instability. The United States supported a coup d'état by South Vietnamese soldiers and helped overthrow the government. Did this solve the problem? No, it didn't. After the coup, the situation became even more chaotic. Seeing the coup, other South Vietnamese elites thought, if you can take over the country with a coup, then I can do it too. This led to continuous coups, with one happening almost every year in South Vietnam. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong were growing more powerful, further destabilizing the region. In the end, the United States, unable to wait any longer, realized that it had to intervene to stabilize South Vietnam. However, if a large country like the United States intervened directly, it could be criticized by the international community. So the United States needed a justification for its actions. Then, an incident occurred that would serve as that justification, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. In August 1964, the U.S. dispatched a rescue ship that was sailing near Vietnam. At that time, in a place called the Gulf of Tonkin, North Vietnamese forces clashed with the U.S. military. The U.S. used this incident as an excuse to claim that North Vietnam had attacked the U.S. military. The U.S. declared that it could not tolerate such an act and that it would intervene in Vietnam. The U.S. then began sending troops to Vietnam and started a full-scale intervention. However, the Gulf of Tonkin incident had some issues. The first claim was that North Vietnam had attacked first, but later reports suggested that the second attack never actually happened, and it was later revealed that the U.S. military may have misheard the engine noise. Regardless, the U.S. declared that North Vietnam had attacked and began its long-awaited military intervention. So, the U.S. military, which had traveled 20,000 kilometers, had to stabilize the situation in South Vietnam, which was on the verge of collapse. To achieve this, the U.S. decided to bomb the Viet Cong in South Vietnam, who continued to operate there. Therefore, the US first deployed a large number of bombers to target North Vietnam. But why did the US bomb North Vietnam instead of focusing solely on the Viet Cong? The reason is that the Viet Cong operating in South Vietnam were receiving support through a secret route from North Vietnam. North Vietnam welcomed the Viet Cong's active operations. To cut off this support, the US military dropped a large number of bombs on various military facilities in North Vietnam for 3 years. However, the results of the bombing were minimal. This was because North Vietnam distributed its military facilities across the country, minimizing the damage by hiding them in tunnels and underground bunkers. After 3 years of bombing, the US was still not able to achieve its desired result. As a result, the Viet Cong, who were hiding in the jungles, were still being supplied and continued to resist. So, what was left for the United States? They considered the possibility of directly invading North Vietnam. If they occupied North Vietnam, they could cut off support for the Viet Cong, destroy North Vietnam, and make the entire country capitalist, ending the situation. But they could not do that. The US knew this was not an option. Why? At the time, the world was in the midst of the Cold War between communism and democracy. North Vietnam was a communist force, and to the north of it lay Communist China and the Soviet Union, the superpowers. In other words, if the US invaded North Vietnam, it would provoke both China and the Soviet Union, leading to a direct challenge to the communist bloc, risking a Third World War. Therefore, the US could never invade North Vietnam. In the end, North Vietnam continued to resist the bombing, and the US military had to switch to fighting the Viet Cong directly in the jungles. This was a war with limits. As a result, in March 1965, US ground forces were sent to South Vietnam to carry out Operation Rolling Thunder against the Viet Cong. Initially, the US military was concerned about troop casualties, so it only provided air support to the South Vietnamese military. However, the South Vietnamese military, under the leadership of the government at the time, was not capable of mounting effective resistance. Eventually, the US military had to send in ground troops. However, they faced a huge problem. Fighting against guerrilla tactics was not easy. The Viet Cong were often hard to locate, hiding in the jungle and ambushing US troops. When the US soldiers advanced, they were constantly anxious, wondering if they were walking into a trap or if mines were buried along the path. Since both the defense and attack strategies were unclear, the Americans found themselves falling behind and were confused about the reasons for the fight. However, despite not fully understanding the situation, US commanders focused on killing as many Viet Cong as possible to reduce their fighting capacity. As a result, the US military had no choice but to kill at least one suspect of being a Viet Cong fighter, as the goal was to eliminate the enemy and reduce the Viet Cong's anti-war efforts. This led to widespread PTSD among soldiers, as the war's nature, fighting in dense jungles against an elusive enemy, was emotionally and mentally draining. Despite the US bombing North Vietnam and killing many Viet Cong fighters, the Viet Cong continued to receive supplies via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which included hundreds of miles of interconnected tunnels. The fighting continued, and the damage to the US military increased over time. Every day, news of US military casualties reached the US mainland, causing growing dissatisfaction among the American public. However, the US government downplayed these reports and attempted to conceal the true nature of the war. In 1968, US President Lyndon Johnson declared that the US military commander in Vietnam believed victory was within reach, claiming that there was light at the end of the tunnel. The US government continued to distort the situation to make it appear advantageous. The government believed that, by controlling public opinion and pushing forward, it could eventually win the war. But this was a deliberate misunderstanding. In 1968, an event occurred that revealed the truth about the Vietnam War to the American public. This was the Tet Offensive. On January 30, 1968, during the Lunar New Year holiday, the Viet Cong launched a large-scale surprise attack on the US military. At the time, the Viet Cong had been enduring losses, but if the war continued, the people of South Vietnam, the source of the Viet Cong's support, could eventually turn against them. So, the Viet Cong decided to launch a massive offensive. Taking advantage of the holiday and the gap in surveillance, they launched simultaneous attacks on 41 major cities in South Vietnam. As many as 600,000 Viet Cong fighters were deployed during the Tet Offensive, which took place on January 30, 1968. What happened during the siege? Unexpectedly, the siege was easily repelled. The Viet Cong, who exerted their power in the jungle, found that fighting in the city was a different situation. They were pushed back by the immense supply and firepower of the United States and were eventually expelled without a trace. As a result, the battle ended in a defeat for the Viet Cong, who suffered around 100,000 casualties. This marked the end of the siege. Now, President Johnson seemed to have only one option left. Ironically, for some reason, the coup became a fatal blow to President Johnson. The coup and its aftermath led to tremendous criticism from the U.S. military and government officials involved in the Vietnam War. This event is often seen as a turning point where the Viet Cong won, but it was actually the U.S. military that won the battle. Why is it considered a victory for the Viet Cong? Because the coup was broadcast live on television in the United States, which was contrary to President Johnson's wishes. During the coup, the Viet Cong also attacked the U.S. Embassy in Vietnam. The scene of the embassy being attacked and occupied was aired in the media and broadcast live on American television. This shocked the American public. President Johnson had claimed that there was light at the end of the tunnel and that victory was near. Yet, Americans saw the Viet Cong attacking the U.S. Embassy. This led to widespread protests and rebellion, with public opinion turning against the war. In an instant, President Johnson's approval rating dropped by 12%. Eventually, he had no choice but to announce that he would not seek re-election. As a result, the entire country shifted away from the war due to this political fallout. Until then, the U.S. High Command had been pushing the war forward, but now public opinion had become so weak that continuing the war was no longer feasible. The most significant turning point in the Vietnam War occurred during the U.S. presidential election, where Richard Nixon, who promised to end the Vietnam War with honorable peace, was elected president. Upon taking office, Nixon began to withdraw U.S. forces from Vietnam. He introduced the Nixon Doctrine in 1969, which stated that Asian countries should no longer rely on the United States for protection and should defend themselves. In line with this, the U.S. began to withdraw its ground forces from Vietnam starting in 1969. The world seemed to be moving toward the end of the Vietnam War. However, a problem arose when Nixon faced an unexpected challenge. The United States had sent 2.7 million troops to Vietnam during the war and had been involved in the conflict for several years. Despite having the strongest military in the world, the U.S. was struggling to leave without any significant results. The withdrawal could easily be perceived as a failure, and this could give the communist camp the upper hand, weakening the U.S.'s position in the Cold War. Nixon understood this but knew the withdrawal had to happen. To avoid appearing weak, he made a shocking decision. Rather than simply withdrawing, he decided to escalate the war one last time. In other words, as they were withdrawing, the U.S. would intensify its bombing of North Vietnam to demonstrate American power. This led to massive bombings of North Vietnam, as well as attacks on Laos and Cambodia, where the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran. Bombing neutral countries was a shocking decision, but the Nixon administration believed it was necessary. However, the result of this decision was not as expected. The Vietnamese forces quickly restored the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and the bombing did little to affect the situation. Meanwhile, the news of these bombings was exposed to the American public, and the backlash was swift. Americans were outraged. "What are you doing?" they asked. "You said you'd end the war, but now you're making it worse." This led to the largest student protests in U.S. history. By the end of 1971, Nixon was under intense pressure, and the majority of U.S. ground forces had already withdrawn from Vietnam. While the Air Force and Naval forces remained to defend South Vietnam, the withdrawal of the U.S. ground forces was a major turning point. North Vietnam, now in a celebratory mood, saw the opportunity to unify the country. With the U.S. military gone, North Vietnam felt it was in a favorable position to take over the South. However, Nixon had one more move left. Though he could have faced a complete failure in the Vietnam War, Nixon's diplomacy saved the situation. He began to pursue a policy of détente to ease Cold War tensions, improving relations with the Soviet Union and meeting with Chinese leader Mao Zedong to discuss reconciliation. This shift in foreign policy made North Vietnam nervous. If Nixon successfully implemented his policy of rapprochement with the Soviet Union and China, North Vietnam could be at a disadvantage. The reason for this is that if the Soviet Union and China were to improve relations with the United States, North Vietnam would find itself in a difficult position. With the U.S. reconciling with the communist powers, there could be a scenario similar to the Geneva Accords, where Vietnam remains divided along the 17th parallel. In such a situation, North Vietnam could be forced into a win-win relationship with the capitalist world. What would North Vietnam do? They wanted unification. But both the Soviet Union and China would not support the use of force. They were not in favor of North Vietnam launching military action. So, North Vietnam had no choice but to act quickly and accelerate the process of reunification by force. To reverse the situation, the North Vietnamese army, which had not previously ordered the Viet Cong to act, launched two major attacks, the Chun Kay and Bu Hao Col attacks. The question is, would these attacks have been successful? At that time, U.S. ground forces had already withdrawn, and the South Vietnamese army was in disarray. However, these attacks failed. The United States did not send reinforcements but instead relied on its remaining overwhelming air and naval power to repel the North Vietnamese forces. Of course, North Vietnam was not able to confront the U.S. directly in a frontal battle. So, North Vietnam suffered a defeat. However, the situation still worked out in their favor in the long run. As feared, neither the Soviet Union nor China interfered with North Vietnam, and soon, U.S. public opinion forced a further withdrawal of all air and naval forces from Vietnam. Thus, the United States prepared to end the war and sought to establish peace. They proposed to North Vietnam, "You saw us withdraw from the Chung dynasty, didn't you? Let's stop fighting and have peace talks. It's in our interest to leave, let's wrap this up." However, North Vietnam was hesitant. The ultimate goal of North Vietnam was the reunification of the country under communist rule, and they weren't willing to accept anything less. Nixon understood the situation. "Okay," he thought, "I'll force you to the negotiating table." And to demonstrate American resolve, he authorized a large-scale bombing campaign, known as Operation Linebacker. During this operation, the U.S. military bombed Hanoi and Haiphong, the heart of North Vietnam. The United States aimed to destroy North Vietnam's infrastructure and military capabilities, sending a clear message: "We will stop only when you negotiate." North Vietnam, already weary from years of war, had no choice but to engage in talks to avoid further destruction. Meanwhile, South Vietnam, which had originally refused to negotiate with the Communists, was forced to participate under U.S. pressure. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The key points of this agreement included the continuation of the division of North and South Vietnam, akin to the Geneva talks, and the temporary withdrawal of U.S. forces from both sides. By March 1973, the U.S. had fully withdrawn, marking the end of American involvement after nearly 9 years of intervention. This led to a brief period of peace, but it didn't last long. North Vietnam, still determined to reunify the country, began preparing for a massive invasion of the South. The United States was aware of this, so when they withdrew, they provided South Vietnam with substantial military support, including weapons worth over $1 billion, believing this would enable the South to defend itself. At the time, the South Vietnamese army had become one of the most heavily armed forces in Asia. However, it was questionable whether the South Vietnamese forces, given their history of defeat and incompetence, would be able to properly utilize these supplies. To further ensure South Vietnam's defense, U.S. diplomat Henry Kissinger promised that if North Vietnam reoccupied South Vietnam, the U.S. would provide comprehensive support. South Vietnam felt more secure as a result. However, just 2 years after the Paris Peace Accords, in January 1975, North Vietnam launched a massive invasion, known as the Red Flower Unification Operation. What happened to the South Vietnamese army? They were quickly overwhelmed. Although the U.S. had provided $1 billion in military aid, the South Vietnamese army was financially incapable of operating such equipment. South Vietnam had built a parasitic economy that was dependent on U.S. aid, but it could not develop a self-sustaining economy. This left them vulnerable. In the end, South Vietnam was quickly pushed back to its capital, Saigon. The collapse happened so fast that even North Vietnam was caught off guard. The United States was furious. They had spent billions of dollars, only to see the South fall. However, as per Kissinger's promise, the U.S. could have intervened to help South Vietnam. But the American public had grown weary of the war, and there was widespread opposition to further intervention. It would have been political suicide for the U.S. government to re-enter the war. As a result, Kissinger's promise was not fulfilled. South Vietnam was completely occupied, and North Vietnam achieved its goal of reunification. In 1976, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam was officially established, and the country became fully communist. Thus, the Vietnam War ended, and all of Vietnam became a communist nation. The U.S. had suffered a defeat despite its vast military involvement, which included 540,000 troops at its peak. The U.S. lost 58,000 soldiers and had 300,000 wounded. South Vietnam lost around 300,000 people, while North Vietnam and the Viet Cong lost approximately 800,000. The U.S. military was unable to achieve its goal of defeating the Viet Cong. The key reason for this was that the Viet Cong were able to integrate with the South Vietnamese peasants, many of whom were dissatisfied with their government and provided support to the Viet Cong. To defeat the Viet Cong, the U.S. would have needed to address the root causes of this discontent by winning over the peasants. However, South Vietnam was plagued by corruption, incompetence, and chaos, which allowed the Viet Cong to persist and continue their insurgency. No matter how much the U.S. military supplied to the South Vietnamese forces, it was ultimately ineffective. Additionally, even if North Vietnam attacked, it was unlikely that North Vietnam itself could be broken down. Despite this, the essence of the war was something the U.S. failed to realize. The Vietnam War was approached primarily as a conflict between North and South Vietnam, much like the Korean War on June 25. The U.S. focused mainly on the futile search for an annihilation of the Viet Cong, failing to recognize the underlying issue. This inability to understand the true nature of the war ultimately led to the U.S.'s defeat. I'll continue to do my best in the new year. That's the end of the video.